Some say there are no second chances in life. Thomas Miller would have agreed, having spent 40 years alone on his Nebraska farm, the memory of his first love fading like old photographs. But when a storm forces a sophisticated stranger to seek shelter in his barn, he finds himself face to face with Catherine Wells, though he doesn't recognize the billionaire CEO as the young woman who once chose ambition over their small-town romance. While the rain pounds against the barn's tin roof, neither realizes that fate has orchestrated this reunion, giving them one last chance to heal the wounds that time couldn't mend. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning dawned with the soft amber light that only Nebraska summers could bring, filtering through curtains Thomas's late mother had sewn decades ago. His weathered hand reached automatically for the checklist on his bedside table, though he hadn't needed its guidance in years. The paper was soft now, creased at the corners, bearing coffee stains and pencil marks that tracked back through seasons of solitude. 5:17 c.m. Check weather report, 5:15 a.m. Morning coffee, 5:30 a.m. Feed chickens, 6:00 a.m. Check equipment, 6:30 a.m. Barn inspection. He traced each item with a calloused finger, his joints stiff from years of honest work. The local weather station crackled through his old radio, warning of an approaching storm system. Thomas made a mental note to secure the newer hay bales in the barn later. The kitchen welcomed him with familiar creaks in the floorboards, each step finding its well-worn place. His coffee maker, the one modern convenience he'd allowed himself in recent years, hummed to life. The rich aroma filled the space where conversation should have been, where laughter once echoed. He glanced at the empty chair across the table, its wood polished smooth from years of waiting for someone who never came back. In the drawer of his desk, beneath farm receipts and seed catalogues, lay a photograph he hadn't looked at in months. He didn't need to. Its image was burned into his memory. A young woman with autumn-red hair and eyes full of dreams, standing beside a fresh-faced version of himself at the county fair. Catherine had been so beautiful that day, her smile outshining the prize ribbons they'd won for their prized Holstein. They were going to build something special together, or so he'd thought. The coffee turned bitter in his mouth. Thomas pushed away from the table, leaving half his cup untouched. The chickens wouldn't feed themselves, and the day's work wouldn't wait for an old man's memories. Outside, the air hung heavy with approaching rain. The weatherman hadn't been wrong. Dark clouds gathered on the western horizon, promising a significant system moving in. Thomas pulled his worn denim jacket closer, its patches and repairs telling stories of years spent working this land alone. The chickens clucked their morning greetings, pecking eagerly at the feed he scattered. "At least you ladies are reliable," he muttered, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. They were simple creatures with simple needs, no dreams of bright lights and big cities to lead them astray. The equipment shed stood as it had for half a century, housing his father's old tractor alongside newer necessities. Thomas ran his hands over the machinery, checking belts and fluid levels with the devotion of a man who understood that preventive care was cheaper than repairs. Each tool hung in its designated spot, the organization a bulwark against the chaos of emotions he kept carefully locked away. As he stepped into the barn, the familiar sense of hay and leather wrapped around him like an old friend's embrace. Sunshine slanted through gaps in the wooden slats, casting strips of gold across the floor. Up in the rafters, where the light barely reached, a small wooden heart gathered dust, one of the few reminders he'd kept of those bright, hopeful days when love seemed as certain as the sunrise. The radio had promised the storm would hit by afternoon. Thomas looked up at the gathering clouds and knew they'd arrive sooner. He could feel it in his bones, the same way he felt the change of seasons or the approach of rain. Something was coming, something more than just weather. If he'd known just how right he was, he might have approached the day differently. But Thomas Miller was a creature of habit. following his checklist with the same dedication that had carried him through 40 years of solitude. The past was the past, he'd always told himself. No sense in expecting it to come thundering back into your life. How wrong he was about to discover he'd been. The first fat drops of rain began to fall as Thomas secured the last hay bale. The storm had arrived faster than expected, bringing with it a darkness that turned early afternoon to dusk. Wind whipped through the barn's open doors, carrying the sharp scent of ozone and wet earth. He'd just reached for the door handles when he heard it, the distinct crunch of tires on his gravel driveway. Through the sheeting rain, he made out the sleek shape of a black luxury car, its headlights cutting twin beams through the gloom. City car, he thought, noting the smooth, unblemished paint and New York plates. The kind of vehicle that had no business on a dirt road in rural Nebraska. The driver's door opened, and a figure emerged, struggling against the wind with what looked like an expensive leather briefcase. A woman, he realized, watching her fight to keep her balance in what he suspected were entirely impractical shoes. The wind caught her silk blouse, plastering it against her body as she made her way toward the barn. "Hello," she called out, her voice nearly lost in a crack of thunder. "I'm so sorry to intrude, but my GPS led me down this road, and then the storm." She stepped into the barn, water streaming from her clothes. Thomas reached for the old horse blanket he kept near the door. "Here," he said, holding it out. "It's clean enough." Up close, he could see she was around his age, though she wore it differently, carefully maintained blonde hair, now dripping around a face that spoke of expensive creams and professional care. "Thank you." She took the blanket with manicured hands, her fingers brushing his briefly. A cracked iPhone peeked out from her pocket, its screen lighting up with what looked like dozens of missed calls and messages. "I don't suppose there's any cell service out here." "Comes and goes," Thomas replied, closing the barn doors against the strengthening wind. "Mostly goes when there's weather like this." He gestured to an old bench near his workstation. "Best wait it out. These summer storms don't usually last too long." She perched on the edge of the bench, somehow managing to look elegant, despite being soaked to the skin. "I really appreciate this. I'm Catherine, by the way. Catherine Wells." She extended her hand formally, then seemed to think better of it, given her dripping state. "Thomas Miller." He nodded, keeping his distance. Something about her sparked an unsettling feeling in his chest, like remembering the tune of a song, but not the words. "You're a long way from New York. You noticed the plates." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I was supposed to be visiting a potential investment property in Grand Island. My driver got sick, and I thought I could handle the trip myself. Clearly, I was mistaken." She glanced at her phone again, frowning at the lack of signal. Thunder rattled the barns. Timbers, and Catherine jumped slightly. Thomas busied himself with lighting the old oil lamp he kept for power outages, trying not to notice how the warm glow softened her features, or how it caught the red undertones in her hair when she moved. "Board meeting," she explained, catching his glance at her phone. "Rather important one, actually. I don't suppose you have a landline I could use." "Phone lines go down same as cell towers out here." He settled onto his work stool, maintaining what he felt was a proper distance from his unexpected guest. "Your folks know where you are? Someone who might worry?" A strange expression crossed her face. "My children are used to me handling myself, though I suppose my assistant will be having fits by now." She attempted to smooth her hair, a gesture that seemed more habit than vanity. "You live here alone, Mr. Miller?" "Just Thomas. And yes, going on 40 years now." He didn't know why he added that last part. Something about her made him want to fill the silence, even as instinct told him to guard his words. Catherine's eyes swept the barn, taking in the neat organization, the well-maintained tools, the subtle signs of a life lived in careful order. "It's peaceful here," she said softly, almost to herself. "Reminds me of—" She stopped, shaking her head slightly. "Of what?" Thomas asked, that unsettling feeling returning stronger than before. "Oh, just somewhere I used to know. A long time ago." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and for a moment she looked less like a polished businesswoman and more like someone lost in thought. Sometimes I forget there are still places like this, where time moves differently. Lightning illuminated the barn through the slats, and in that brief, brilliant moment, Thomas saw something in her profile that made his heart stutter. But it couldn't be. That girl was gone, had been gone so long he'd trained himself not to look for her in the faces of strangers. Yet as the thunder rolled over them and the rain drummed against the roof, he found himself studying his guest with new eyes, trying to reconcile the elegant woman before him with shadows from his past. It was impossible, he told himself. The Catherine he'd known would never have become this sophisticated creature with her designer clothes and New York life. But then she laughed at something. A chicken strutting importantly past the barn. Doors, and the sound struck him like a physical blow. Some things it seemed time couldn't change at all. The old radio on Thomas's workbench crackled to life unexpectedly, making them both start. Through bursts of static, the opening notes of a song drifted out, something from the 1970s that made Catherine tilt her head. "Is that—" She leaned forward, straining to hear through the interference. "Summer Rain." Thomas nodded, surprised. "Johnny Rivers. Don't get many people recognizing songs that old anymore." "My father loved that song." Catherine's voice softened with memory. "We used to—" She stopped, that same peculiar expression crossing her face. "The station out here still plays the classics. When it's working." Thomas reached over to adjust the dial, but the music was already fading back into static. Signal's not what it used to be, kind of like everything else. He hadn't meant to sound bitter, but something about her presence was unsettling the careful balance of his world. Catherine stood, walking to the workbench where the radio sat. Her fingers traced its wooden edges. Careful and almost reverent. "My grandmother had one just like this. We'd listen to the farm report every morning while she made breakfast." She paused, looking down at her expensive manicure against the weathered wood. "Strange, the things you forget until something reminds you." Thunder growled overhead, and a fresh gust of wind rattled the barn doors. Catherine wrapped the horse blanket tighter around her shoulders, and for a moment, the sophisticated CEO facade cracked just enough to show something more vulnerable underneath. "You said you're from around here?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Originally, I mean." She turned away, moving to watch the rain through a gap in the wooden slats. "What makes you say that?" "The way you knew about the farm report. City folks don't usually have memories like that." A smile touched her lips, but she didn't turn around. "I grew up on a farm, different lifetime ago." Her fingers worried at a loose thread on the blanket. "Learned to drive on a tractor before I ever saw a car." Thomas's heart picked up its pace. He forced himself to stay seated to keep his voice steady. "Must have been quite a journey going from that to—" He gestured at her tailored clothes, her careful appearance. "To this?" She laughed, but the sound held no humor. "Yes, well, ambition is a powerful fuel. Burns up a lot of things in its fire." She turned back to face him. "Including things you later wish you'd kept." The radio sputtered again, a few notes of another old song bleeding through before dying away. This time they both reached for the dial, their hands nearly touching before Catherine pulled back as if burned. "Sorry," she murmured. It sounded like wild horses." Her eyes met his, and something flickered there. Recognition, maybe, or fear of it. The Stones were playing that the night of the Harrison County Fair, summer of '82. Right before the fireworks. Thomas felt the floor shift beneath him. He gripped the edge of his workbench, steadying himself. That night, those fireworks, the way she'd looked in her blue cotton dress, swaying to the music while sparklers painted the sky in gold. "How did you—" His voice came out rough. "That fair was—" "A long time ago." Catherine's face had gone pale beneath her careful makeup. She took a step back, then another, putting distance between them. "I'm sorry, I don't know why I mentioned that. Strange how memories surface, isn't it? Must be the storm making me nostalgic." But Thomas wasn't listening anymore. He was seeing her differently now, looking past the expensive clothes and sophisticated manner to something underneath. The way she held herself when she was nervous, one hand unconsciously touching her collarbone, the slight tilt of her head when she was thinking, the trace of an accent she'd nearly erased, but couldn't quite hide when emotion crept into her voice. "Kathy," he whispered, the nickname he hadn't spoken in 40 years falling from his lips before he could stop it. "Dear God, it's you." The color drained completely from her face. She reached blindly for the workbench, steadying herself. "Nobody's called me that in—" Her eyes met his, really saw him for the first time. "Tommy!" They stared at each other across the barn's dusty floor, across 40 years of silence, across all the choices and changes that had led them to this moment. The storm raged outside, but in the barn time seemed to stand still. Then Catherine's phone buzzed sharply in her pocket, shattering the moment. She jumped, fumbling for it with shaking hands. I should check if I have signal." The board. "Meeting Kathy," Thomas said again, taking a step toward her. "Don't." She held up a hand, her professional mask sliding back into place like a shield. "Please, just don't." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the drumming of rain and distant thunder. Thomas turned away, his hands busy with something on his workbench, movements automatic as his mind raced. After a moment, he reached up to the rafters, fingers finding a familiar shape in the shadows. "Found this last spring," he said quietly, not turning around. "Was fixing a leak in the roof when I spotted it." He held out a small wooden heart, its surface dulled by decades of dust. Carved into its center were their initials, TM plus CH, surrounded by a simple pattern of wheat stalks. Catherine's carefully maintained composure cracked. "You kept it?" Her voice wavered as she reached for the carved heart, then pulled back without touching it. "All this time?" "Didn't keep it exactly." Thomas set it on the workbench between them. "Just never got around to throwing it away, like a lot of things." The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. "I deserve that," Catherine said softly. She moved closer to the workbench, eyes fixed on the wooden heart. "I remember the day you made this. You spent hours getting the wheat pattern just right. County Fair weekend. You wore that blue dress with the white collar." The memory rose. "Unbidden, sharp and clear despite the years. Said you had something important to tell me." Catherine flinched. "Tommy, I don't." He echoed her earlier warning. "What's done is done, Kathy. We both made our choices." "Did we?" She looked up at him then, and for a moment he saw past the careful makeup and expensive styling to the girl he'd known. "Or did I make the choice for both of us?" A particularly loud crack of thunder made the barn's timbers creak. In the aftermath of the sound, Thomas could hear Catherine's shaky breath. "I had dreams," she said, each word careful and measured. "Things I wanted to achieve. The scholarship to Northwestern. I remember the scholarship." Thomas picked up the wooden heart, turning it over in his weathered hands. "Remember you saying we could make it work. Weekend visits. Summer breaks." His fingers traced the carved initials. "Remember you saying a lot of things. I was 18. The words burst from her like they'd been held back for decades. 18 and scared, and so desperate to prove I could be more than just another farm girl who married her high school sweetheart and never saw the world. And I was what?" Thomas's voice remained quiet, but there was steel beneath it. "The anchor that would drag you down? The simple farm boy who'd keep you from your grand ambitions?" "No!" Catherine pressed her hands to her temples, smearing her perfect makeup. "God, no, Tommy, you were—" She swallowed hard. "You were the hardest thing I ever walked away from." The wooden heart slipped from Thomas's fingers, clattering onto the workbench. Catherine reached for it instinctively, and their hands met over the carved surface. For a heartbeat, neither moved. "I look for you sometimes," she whispered, not meeting his eyes. "In crowds, at airports, even after all these years I catch myself turning when I hear someone laugh like you used to." Her fingers trembled against his. "I built an empire, did everything I set out to do. But some nights, lying in my penthouse apartment, all I can think about is the smell of summer rain on Nebraska soil. Thomas withdrew his hand slowly, leaving the wooden heart in her grasp. You could have written, called, something in 40 years to let me know you were more than just a memory I couldn't shake. Would it have made it easier? She looked up at him finally, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Or would it have just kept the wound from ever truly healing? Before he could answer, a flash of lightning illuminated the barn's interior, followed immediately by an explosive crack of thunder. Catherine startled, the wooden heart falling from her hands. They both reached for it, but it hit the floor and split along an old grain line, breaking nearly in half. They stared at the broken pieces, the carved initials now separated by the break. The metaphor wasn't lost on either of them. Still breaking things between us, Catherine said softly, kneeling to pick up the pieces. Some things never change. But as she held out the broken heart, Thomas saw the truth that had eluded them both for 40 years. Sometimes things had to break completely before they could be mended into something new. Thomas took the broken pieces from Catherine's hands, setting them carefully on the workbench. From a drawer, he pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping, edges soft from handling. The headline read, "Local Girl Makes Good, Catherine Harrison. Wells named youngest female CEO in tech industry. Found this about 15 years ago," he said, smoothing the creased paper. "Mary Beth from the diner brought it by. Thought I should see it." He paused, studying the professional headshot that accompanied the article. "You looked happy. Successful." Catherine stepped closer, her own face staring back at her from the page. "I remember that interview. They wanted the rags to riches angle. Farm girl conquers Silicon Valley." She laughed softly. "I gave them what they wanted. Talked about determination, ambition, the American dream. Never mentioned what it cost. Seems like it paid off well enough." Thomas's voice held no judgment, just a quiet observation. "Did it?" Catherine turned away, pacing the length of the barn. "I have 3 children who schedule appointments to see their mother. A corner office with a view of Central Park that I'm too busy to enjoy. More money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes." She stopped at the barn door, watching the rain. "And some nights, I still dream of fireflies in mason jars and the sound of crickets in the cornfield. Dreams don't pay bills or put food on the table." Thomas folded the clipping carefully, years of practice keeping his hands steady. "You made the practical choice." "Practical?" Catherine whirled to face him. "There was nothing practical about it. I was terrified, Tommy, terrified of disappearing into someone else's life, of becoming just an extension of the farm, of waking up 20 years later, wondering what if." Her voice cracked. "So I ran so far and so fast, I forgot how to stop." "And now?" Thomas asked quietly. "Still running?" Catherine's shoulders slumped. "Now I'm CEO of a company worth billions, and I can't remember the last time I felt truly at home anywhere." She wrapped her arms around herself, the expensive silk of her blouse catching on the rough wool of the horse blanket. "My oldest, Michael, he asked me last month what I wanted for my birthday. Know what I told him? Nothing. Because what I really wanted was something no amount of money could buy. Just one more summer evening, sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the cornfield with you." Thomas felt something shift in his chest, like ice breaking up in spring. "Could have had a lot of those evenings, Kathy. All you had to do was stay, or come back." "Come back?" She laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. "To what? The girl who left? She doesn't exist anymore, and the woman I became." She gestured at herself, at the designer clothes and careful polish. "She doesn't belong here." "Maybe neither of us is who we were back then," Thomas said, moving to stand beside her at the door. 40 years changes people. Had to change, or a break. Catherine turned to look at him, really look at him, seeing the silver in his hair, the lines around his eyes, the strength still evident in his weathered hands. "Did you ever marry?" she asked softly. "No." He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. They both knew why. "I did. Twice." She smiled sadly. Both successful men, driven, ambitious. Everything I thought I wanted. She traced a pattern in the condensation. On the barn door. Neither one lasted. Turns out ambition makes a poor substitute for love. Thunder rolled overhead again, but softer now, the storm beginning to move away. In the distance, they could hear the wind dying down, the rain settling into a gentle pattern. You know what the worst part is? Catherine's voice was barely above a whisper. Every achievement, every milestone, every success, there was always this empty space where you should have been. The one person I wanted to share it all with was the one person I'd left behind. Thomas reached out slowly, his hand hovering near her shoulder before dropping back to his side. Can't change the past, Kathy. God knows I've spent enough years trying. No, she agreed, turning to face him. But maybe we can stop letting it poison the present. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the steady drumming of rain. Thomas moved to his workbench, searching through a drawer until he found an old thermos. "Still take your coffee black?" he asked, unscrewing the cap. Catherine's eyes widened slightly at the memory. "You remember that? Remember a lot of things." He poured the dark liquid into two mismatched mugs, the steam rising between them. "Some you can't forget, no matter how hard you try." She accepted the cup, her designer jacket now draped over a nearby rail beside his worn work coat, a stark contrast that told their story without words. "It's funny," she said, warming her hands around the mug, "how familiar this feels, like no time has passed at all, except it has." Thomas settled onto his work stool, watching her over the rim of his cup. "Tell me about your children." Something softened in Catherine's face. "Michael's the oldest. 32 now, if you can believe it. He's a surgeon in Boston." She smiled. "Has your sense of dedication, actually. Never does anything halfway." "Our sense of dedication," Thomas corrected gently. "You were never one to leave things unfinished. Well, except us." She met his eyes steadily. "Fair enough. Then there's Sarah, 28. She's the rebel. Quit her job at a prestigious law firm to start a non-profit. Works with rural communities, helping them modernize their farming practices." Catherine's laugh held a note of irony. "Sometimes I think she's living the life I ran away from." "And the third?" "Emma, my baby. Though she's 24 now, she's—" Catherine paused, taking a sip of coffee. "She's the one who reminds me most of who I used to be. Has that same restlessness I had, that need to prove herself. I see her making some of my same mistakes, and I can't say anything because, well, who am I to give advice about following your heart?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Sounds like you raised them well, despite everything." "I tried. Wasn't always there as much as I should have been, but—" She traced the rim of her mug. "What about you, Tommy? Any regrets about not having children?" "Had the farm," he said simply. "Had my brother's kids around plenty before they moved to Oregon. Got to be Uncle Tommy. Teach them about the land. Watch them grow up some." He smiled slightly. "They still call every Christmas, send pictures of their own little ones. But it's not the same." "No," he agreed. "It's not. But we make peace with our choices, don't we?" Catherine set her mug down, the china clinking softly against the wooden workbench. "Do we make peace with them? Because I've spent 40 years trying, and some nights I still wake up wondering, what might have been?" Thomas finished for her. "Yeah, know that feeling well enough." Outside, the storm had settled into a steady rain, no longer threatening but still keeping them confined together in this moment out of time. Catherine stood, walking to where their jackets hung side by side. "Life has a strange way of coming. Full circle," she said, reaching out to touch the worn denim of his coat. "All my success, all my carefully laid plans, and here I am, sheltering from a storm in your barn, drinking coffee from the same kind of mugs we used back then." "Some things don't change," Thomas said. "Storm comes up, you seek shelter. Simple as that." "Is it?" She turned to face him. "Because right now, Tommy, I'm feeling anything but simple. I'm feeling like that 18-year-old girl again, standing in this very barn, trying to choose between her dreams and her heart. Only this time, she took a shaky breath. This time I know exactly what I'd be giving up. The weight of those words hung between them, heavy with possibility and the wisdom of years lived, mistakes made, lessons learned the hard way. The moment was broken by a sudden burst of static from Catherine's phone, followed by a cascade of message notifications. The signal had returned, bringing reality crashing back into their bubble of memory and possibility. Oh, God. Catherine fumbled with the device, her face paling as she scrolled through the messages. The board meeting, the vote on the merger. Her fingers flew over the screen, composing rapid responses. They're threatening to postpone the entire deal. Thomas watched her transform before his eyes, the vulnerable woman of moments ago replaced by the CEO. Her spine straightened. Her voice took on a different timbre, and even her expression changed, becoming sharp, focused, almost predatory. "This is a $4 billion deal," she explained, though he hadn't asked. 8 months of negotiations, regulatory approvals, shareholder meetings. She pulled up a document on her phone, a complex contract filled with legal terms and figures that made Thomas's head spin. "If we don't close this today, we risk losing everything we've worked for." "Everything you've worked for," Thomas corrected quietly. Catherine looked up from her phone, conflict clear in her eyes. "I have 3,000 employees depending on me, Tommy. Families, mortgages, children's college funds. I can't just what?" He stood, moving to the barn doors. The barn. The rain had lightened enough to see the driveway. "Your car should make it out now. Road's still good." "Tommy, please." She took a step toward him, then stopped, caught between movement and memory. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Seems to me it's pretty simple." He kept his back to her, voice carefully neutral. "Duty calls, just like last time." The clicking of her phone keyboard paused. "That's not fair. Life rarely is." He turned to face her. "Go. Do what you need to do. Some things don't change, right? Storm passes, you move on." Catherine's hands fell to her sides, the phone forgotten for a moment. "Is that what you think happened? That I just moved on? Didn't you?" He gestured to her expensive clothes, her technology, all the trappings of her success. "Seems like you did just fine." "Fine?" Her laugh held no humor. "You want to know what fine looks like, Tommy? It looks like checking the local obituaries every week for 40 years, terrified I'll see your name. It looks like driving 3 hours out of my way on business trips just to pass by the farm, never quite brave enough to turn in. It looks like keeping a jar of Nebraska soil on my office windowsill and telling people it's a conversation piece when really it's all I have left of home." The phone buzzed again. Insistent, Catherine closed her eyes, composing herself. When she opened them, the CEO was back in place. "I have to take this call," she said, her voice professional once more. "It's my responsibility." Thomas nodded, reaching for the barn door. "Like I said, road's clear enough now." But before he could open it, Catherine's voice cut through the air, sharp with sudden decision. "Actually, would you mind if I took the call here? It might help to have a different perspective on things." Thomas turned, surprised. "You want my input on your billion-dollar merger?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "You always did have a way of seeing through to the heart of things. Maybe that's exactly what I need right now." The phone continued, its urgent buzzing. Catherine looked down at it, then back at Thomas, and for a moment he saw both versions of her. The ambitious CEO and the farm girl who'd once dreamed of changing the world. This time, though, maybe she didn't have to choose between them. Thomas watched as Catherine set her phone on speaker and placed it on his workbench, right next to his old ledger book, where he tracked 40 years of crop yields and expenses in neat, careful rows. "Catherine Wells joining," she announced, her voice carrying that distinctive tone of authority he was still getting used to. "I have you on speaker. I'm currently taking shelter from a storm, and I have someone here whose insight I'd value on this matter." A chorus of voices erupted from the phone, all talking about percentages, market valuations, and terms Thomas had never heard before. He listened quietly, noting how Catherine handled each voice with practiced ease, like a conductor leading an orchestra. "The issue," said a particularly strident voice, "is that Rural Tech's board is pushing for a higher valuation based on their agricultural automation patents. They're claiming our original offer undervalues their contribution to the merger." Thomas's ears perked up at the mention of agricultural automation. He reached for his ledger, thumbing through its pages. "If I may," he said, surprising himself as much as Catherine, "what exactly are these automation systems designed to do?" There was a pause on the line. Catherine nodded encouragingly. "They've developed AI-driven farming equipment," someone explained. "Tractors that can operate independently, smart irrigation systems, that sort of thing." Thomas found the page he was looking for. "And how many actual farmers did they consult when developing these systems?" Another pause. Catherine's eyes narrowed with interest. "I'm not sure that's relevant to the valuation," the strident voice began. "Actually," Thomas continued, "it's exactly relevant. See here?" He showed Catherine his ledger. "Last 10 years of rainfall patterns, soil composition changes, crop rotations. Farming isn't just about machinery following programmed patterns. It's about understanding the land, reading the weather, knowing when to work and when to wait." He tapped the page. "No AI can replace that kind of knowledge. Not yet, anyway." Catherine leaned forward, studying the careful notes and calculations in his ledger. "Thomas is right," she said into the phone. "Rural Tech's patents are valuable, but they're not game-changing, not without the human element." She straightened up. "In fact, I propose we counter with our original offer, but with an added condition." The board members waited in silence. "We'll establish a farmers' advisory board. Real farmers with real experience helping guide the development of these technologies. Make them practical, not just theoretical." She glanced at Thomas. "I happen to know where we can start finding members for that board." The discussion continued, but Thomas was barely listening now. He was watching Catherine's face as she negotiated, seeing how she took his simple farmer's wisdom and translated it into something her corporate world could understand. She was building a bridge between their two worlds, right there on his workbench. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the call ended with a tentative agreement. Catherine slumped slightly, the CEO mask slipping. "That ledger of yours might have just saved a $4 billion deal," she said, smiling. "How do you feel about being the first member of our new advisory board?" Thomas closed the ledger carefully. "Didn't do anything special, just told the truth as I know it. Sometimes the simplest answer is the right one." "Simple answers." Catherine shook her head, laughing softly. "I've spent so many years making things complicated, I almost forgot what those looked like." She picked up the ledger, handling it with surprising reverence. All these years of careful records, watching over the land, understanding its rhythms. While I was building my empire, you were building something just as valuable, something real. "Different kinds of success," Thomas said quietly. "Maybe they don't have to be separate." The look Catherine gave him then was full of something he hadn't seen in 40 years. Possibility. A shaft of sunlight suddenly pierced through the barn's windows, catching dust motes in its golden beam. The storm had passed, taking with it the last excuse for Catherine to stay. "Seems the weather's cleared," Thomas said, moving to open the barn doors. Fresh, rain-washed air rushed in, carrying the sweet scent of wet earth and new possibilities. "I suppose it has." Catherine didn't move toward her car, though. Instead, she reached into her briefcase and pulled out her wallet, removing a small collection of photos. Would you like to see them? My children." Thomas nodded, pulling up an old milk crate to sit beside her on the workbench. The first photo showed a tall young man in surgical scrubs, his mother's determination evident in the set of his jaw. "Michael," Catherine said softly. "This was the day he completed his first solo surgery. He called me right after, still in the operating room." Her finger traced the edge of the photo. "He said, 'Mum, I finally understand why you always pushed so hard for what you wanted. Some dreams are worth fighting for. The next photo showed a woman with Catherine's red hair standing in front of a greenhouse. Sarah, Catherine explained, this is her project in Guatemala. She's helping local farmers implement sustainable practices. She paused, smiling. She'd love this place. You know, would probably spend hours going through your ledgers, learning your methods. The last photo was of a younger woman, fierce and fashionable, clearly her mother's daughter. Emma, Catherine said, she's actually been asking a lot of questions lately about where I came from, she glanced at Thomas, about who I was before. Thomas studied each photo carefully, seeing traces of the girl he'd known in each of her children's faces. They seem like good people, he said finally. You did well by them. I tried. Catherine tucked the photos back into her wallet. But sometimes I wonder if I taught them too much about ambition and not enough about balance, she gestured to the barn around them, about knowing what really matters. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the drip of water from the barn's eaves and the distant call of birds emerging after the storm. You know, Thomas said finally, I make a decent beef stew, got some simmering in the slow cooker up at the house. Be ready about now. Catherine glanced at her phone, then back at him. I should probably get back. To what? Thomas asked, gently. Another empty hotel room? More meetings? He stood, brushing dust from his jeans. Stay for dinner, Kathy. Tell me more about your kids, about your life. Maybe, he hesitated, then pushed forward. Maybe it's time we both stopped running. From the past, she looked at him for a long moment, then reached for her phone. Her fingers moved swiftly over the screen, composing a message. Just letting my assistant know I'll be taking the evening off, she explained, for a very important business dinner with my new agricultural advisor. Thomas smiled, offering his hand to help her up. As they walked toward the farmhouse, their footsteps falling naturally in sync, he realized something. Sometimes the greatest storms in life came not to destroy, but to clear the way for new growth. The farmhouse kitchen hadn't changed much in 40 years. The same worn linoleum, the same solid oak table, even the same coffee-stained countertops. But now, alongside Thomas's battered almanac, lay Catherine's sleek tablet, its screen displaying market projections and agricultural data. Your irrigation systems are surprisingly efficient, Catherine noted, scrolling through his recorded rainfall data she'd just input into her analytics program. But with some smart technology integration, we could potentially increase yield by 20%. Thomas stirred the stew, hiding a smile. Been farming this land pretty well without apps and algorithms. I know. Catherine held up her hands in surrender. But imagine combining your expertise with modern technology. The best of both worlds. She paused, the phrase hanging meaningful between them. Like right now, Thomas set 2 bowls. On the table, the rich aroma of beef stew filling the kitchen. Modern CEO sitting in my kitchen, eating from the same bowls we used back in high school? Catherine traced the chip in her bowl's rim. Still there after all these years. I remember the day this happened. We were washing dishes, and you were trying to teach me to juggle, and you dropped everything because I kissed you. Thomas sat down across from her. Some memories don't fade. She took a spoonful of stew, closing her eyes at the familiar taste. Still use your mother's recipe, I see. Some things shouldn't be modernized. But he glanced at her tablet with growing interest. Though I admit, those yield projections are intriguing. Catherine's face lit up. She reached for her tablet, then stopped herself. Sorry, I'm doing it again, trying to fix everything with technology and spreadsheets. This was supposed to be dinner, not a business meeting. Why can't it be both? Thomas surprised himself by asking. You're still that girl who could see possibilities where others saw problems. Only difference is, now you have the means to make those possibilities real. She studied him for a moment. Come look at something. She pulled up a series of satellite images on her tablet. This is your farm from above, but watch what happens when I overlay the soil composition data. They spent the next hour bent over the tablet together, his practical knowledge combining with her technological resources. Catherine's fingers flew over the screen, taking notes as Thomas pointed out drainage patterns and explained crop rotation strategies that had taken him decades to perfect. "This is incredible," she breathed, looking at the merged data. "The way you've maximized the natural contours of the land. Our agricultural tech division could learn so much from this. And maybe I could learn a thing or two about modern methods," Thomas admitted. "World keeps turning after all." Catherine set her tablet down, suddenly serious. "It doesn't have to be just business, you know. This collaboration," she gestured, "between them. Unless you'd prefer to keep things professional." Thomas reached across the table, his weathered hand covering her manicured one. "Kathy, nothing about us has ever been just professional." The moment stretched between them, full of possibilities. Then Catherine's tablet chimed with an incoming video call. The name Emma flashed on the screen. "My daughter," Catherine explained, looking torn. "She always calls on Tuesday evenings." "Answer it," Thomas said softly. "Some things shouldn't wait." Catherine hesitated, then squeezed his hand. Would you like to meet her? I mean, through the screen at least?" The world of video calls and digital connections was far from Thomas's comfort zone, but watching Catherine's face as she looked between him and her daughter's name on the screen, he realized some modernizations were worth embracing. After the video call ended, during which Emma had been both startled and intrigued by Thomas's presence, Catherine grew quiet. She walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the darkening fields where fireflies were beginning to dance. "She looks like you," Thomas said softly. "Has your spark." "She asked me once," Catherine replied, still facing the window, "why I never talked about my life before New York. I told her it was complicated." She turned back to face him. "But that wasn't true. It wasn't complicated at all. It was too simple, too pure to explain to someone who grew up with private schools and summer homes." Thomas moved to his desk in the corner, opening the bottom drawer. Speaking of explanations, he pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age, the seal still intact. "Found this about 10 years after you left. It had fallen behind the post office boxes. Old Joe found it when they were renovating." Catherine's hand flew to her mouth. "My letter. You never opened it. Figured whatever it said wouldn't change anything. You were gone. Had your new life." He held the letter out to her. Maybe it's time we both knew what it said. With trembling fingers, Catherine broke the seal, unfolding paper that had grown brittle with time. Her eyes filled with tears as she recognized her younger self's handwriting. "Dear Tommy," she read aloud, her voice wavering. "By the time you read this, I'll be on my way to Chicago. I told myself I was being brave, following my dreams. But the truth is, I'm terrified of leaving, but even more terrified of staying and resenting you for it later." She paused, collecting herself. "I love you enough to know that's not what either of us deserves. You're too good, too genuine to be someone's second choice or consolation prize. I hope someday you'll understand that this isn't about choosing success over love. It's about needing to know who I am outside of us." Thomas stood perfectly still, letting the words wash over him. Words that had waited 40 years to be heard. "I'm leaving this letter because I'm not brave enough to say goodbye in person, because if I saw your face, felt your arms around me one more time, I might not be strong enough to go. And I need to be strong right now, even if it breaks both our hearts." Catherine's voice broke. "I'm so sorry, Tommy, for not being brave enough to say this to your face, for not being wise enough to know that sometimes the biggest dreams are also the simplest ones. Maybe someday." She couldn't finish. The letter fell from her hands, decades of unspoken words scattering across the floor. "All these years," Thomas said quietly, "I thought you left because I wasn't enough. Because this life wasn't enough." "No," Catherine whispered. I left because I was afraid of not being enough, afraid of waking up one day full of regret and blame. I thought I was choosing myself, but really, she looked around the kitchen at the life she might have had. Really, I was running from myself. Thomas picked up the fallen letter, smoothing its creases with gentle hands. We were so young, he said. Too young to know that life isn't about either-or choices. That sometimes the biggest dreams are the ones that grow slowly, like winter wheat under snow. And now, Catherine asked, her voice small, is it too late for those dreams to grow? Before Thomas could answer, headlights swept across the kitchen. Window, a car turning into his driveway. Catherine moved to look, then froze. That's my daughter's car, Emma's car. She turned to Thomas, eyes wide. She said she was in Denver for meetings. What is she doing here? Emma burst into the kitchen like a summer storm, all energy and determination. She stopped short at the sight of them, her polished mother in designer clothes standing in this rustic farmhouse kitchen, Thomas still holding the aged letter. Mom, Emma's eyes darted between them. When you said you were with a potential agricultural advisor, I thought... She paused, taking in the scene, the half-eaten bowls of stew, the comfortable intimacy of the moment she'd interrupted. Oh, this isn't just about business, is it? Catherine smoothed her silk blouse, a nervous gesture Thomas remembered from decades ago. Emma, honey, what are you doing here? I was worried. Emma dropped her bag on a kitchen chair. Designer, leather against worn wood. You never miss board meetings, never. And then this cryptic message about taking the evening off for dinner with an advisor. She looked at Thomas more carefully. But he's not just an advisor, is he? This is the farm you grew up near, which means... Hello, Emma, Thomas said quietly. I'm Thomas Miller. Your mother and I knew each other a long time ago. Understanding dawned in Emma's eyes. The wooden heart, she breathed. The one in your office, Mom. The one you never talk about, but always touch when you're making big decisions. She turned to her mother. He made it, didn't he? Catherine nodded, unable to speak. All these years, Emma continued, pacing the kitchen, I've been trying to understand you, Mom. Why you push so hard, why success never seems to be enough, why you can't seem to... She stopped, facing them both. You've been running. All this. In time, you've been running from this, from him. Emma... Catherine started, but her daughter cut her off. No, let me finish, because I think I finally get it. She pulled out her phone, pulling up a business proposal draft. I've been working on this for months. A new division combining traditional farming wisdom with cutting-edge technology. Sustainable agriculture, but with real, practical experience behind it. She looked at Thomas. We need people like you. Knowledge that can't be coded into an algorithm. Thomas moved to look at the proposal on her phone. Your mother and I were just discussing something similar. Were you? Emma's smile was knowing. And was it really about business? Or was it about finding a way to bridge two worlds? Catherine sank into a kitchen chair. When did you get so wise? Learned from the best. Emma sat beside her mother. You taught me to chase my dreams, Mom. But you never told me why you stopped. Chasing yours. She reached for Catherine's hand. Until today, I never understood what you left behind. But looking at you now, in this kitchen, she gestured around them. I've never seen you look so... at home. Thomas cleared his throat. There's a lot of history here, Emma. Complicated history. Is it? Emma challenged. Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty simple. Two people who never stopped loving each other, finally getting a second chance. She stood, gathering her bag. I have a hotel room in town. I think you two have more to discuss. Emma, wait, Catherine called as her daughter reached the door. How did you know where to find me? Emma smiled. Mum, you've had this farm's coordinates saved in your phone's favorites for as long as I can remember. I just never knew why until now. She paused at the door. Don't run away this time, okay? Some dreams are worth staying for. After she left, silence filled the kitchen. Then Catherine laughed softly. She's something, isn't she? She's extraordinary, Thomas agreed, just like her mother. He sat down across from Catherine. She's right, you know, about the dreams worth staying for. Catherine reached across the table, taking his hand. I'm starting to understand that. Finally. Morning came too soon, sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows where they'd talked until the early hours. Catherine's phone lay silent next to Thomas's tractor keys on the counter, a stark reminder of their different worlds. The board. Will expect me back today, Catherine said, cradling a cup of coffee. The merger paperwork needs to be finalized. Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. Life doesn't stop just because we found each other again. No, it doesn't. She set her cup down, running a finger along the familiar chip in its rim. But maybe it doesn't have to be like last time. Maybe there's a way. Her phone came to life, buzzing across the counter. Catherine reached for it automatically, then stopped, her hand hovering between the phone and Thomas's tractor keys. You should answer it, Thomas said gently. Your life isn't something you need to apologize for, Kathy. She picked up the phone, scanning the messages. They've called an emergency board meeting. The rural tech representatives are pushing back on the advisory board idea. She looked up at him. They're saying traditional farmers won't understand the technology, that it'll slow down implementation. Thomas stood, moving to the window. Beyond the glass, his fields stretched out, golden in the morning light. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm too set in my ways for your modern world. No, Catherine's voice was firm. They're wrong, and I can prove it. She joined him at the window. Look at your land, Tommy. Really look at it. You've kept this farm profitable for 40 years, while others failed. You've adapted, innovated in your own way. The methods in your ledger, they're not just tradition, they're wisdom. Wisdom doesn't always translate well to a boardroom. Then we make them understand. Catherine turned to face him. Come, back with me. Thomas blinked. To New York? Just for a few days. Help me show them what real farming knowledge looks like. Help me bridge these worlds. She reached for his hand. Not just for the business, Tommy. For us. He looked down at their joined hands, her manicured fingers entwined with his work-roughened ones. And then what? I go back to my farm, you go back to your office, and we pretend a few days can make up for 40 years? No, Catherine said, softly. Then we figure out what comes next. Together. She squeezed his hand. I'm not that scared 18-year-old anymore, running from what I thought would hold me back. I'm successful enough now to know that success isn't everything. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, looking out at his fields. Finally, he turned to her. The soybeans need checking before I could leave, and someone would have to feed the chickens. Is that a yes? Hope bloomed in Catherine's voice. It's a maybe, he said carefully, but first, there's something you need to see. He picked up his tractor keys. Come on. I want to show you what you'd be asking me to leave behind. Catherine looked between his keys and her phone, then set the phone down deliberately. Show me. As they stepped out into the morning sun, Catherine's high heels sinking slightly into the soft earth. They both understood this wasn't just about a business trip to New York. It was about finding out if the life they'd once dreamed of could still have a place in the world they'd built without each other. The tractor moved steadily across the field, Catherine perched beside Thomas in the cab. She'd insisted on keeping her business clothes on, saying she needed to understand how to bridge both worlds exactly as they were. This field here, Thomas said, gesturing to the expanse before them, was where your father taught us both to drive stick shift. Remember? How could I forget? You took to it naturally. I kept grinding the gears. She smiled at the memory. Dad said I was trying to force it instead of feeling it. The tractor crested a small rise, revealing the valley below. Here, Thomas had implemented his most innovative farming techniques, a careful blend of traditional wisdom and practical adaptation. See those irrigation channels? He pointed to the gentle contours of the land. Designed them based on the natural watershed. Works better than any computerized system because it follows what the land wants to do. Catherine pulled out her tablet, already making notes. This is exactly what I've been trying to explain to the board. Technology shouldn't replace natural wisdom. It should enhance it. She looked up at him. Tommy, this isn't just about us anymore. This could change how modern farming evolves. They stopped at the field's edge where an old oak tree still stood sentinel. Their initials, carved decades ago, had grown and stretched with the bark, but remained legible. "I've been thinking," Catherine said, her fingers tracing the aged carving. "What if we renovated the old Matthews place next door? Update it with modern amenities, build a home office. I could run most of the company remotely, fly to New York. When needed." "Kathy," Thomas interrupted gently, "you don't have to give up your life for this to work." "I'm not giving up anything," she insisted. "I'm gaining something back, something I never should have lost." She pulled up architectural plans on her tablet. "Emma's been helping me with this. Look." The plans showed a thoughtful blend of old and new, solar panels alongside traditional farmhouse architecture, a state-of-the-art home office with views of the fields, modern comfort that didn't sacrifice rustic charm. "You've put a lot of thought into this," Thomas said quietly. "I have, because this time I want to do it right." She set the tablet down. "I called Michael and Sarah this morning, told them everything. Want to know what they said?" Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. "Michael said it was about time I stopped checking those obituaries and started living again. And Sarah—" Catherine laughed softly. "Sarah asked if she could bring her sustainable farming team out here to learn from you. And what about your board, your company? The company will adapt. It needs to, if we're going to truly understand the future of agriculture." She took his hand. "Tommy, 40 years ago, I thought I had to choose between love and ambition. I was wrong. Sometimes the most ambitious thing you can do is believe in love." The morning sun caught the dew on the fields, making the world sparkle around them. In the distance, they could see Emma's car pulling up the drive, probably bringing more plans, more ideas, more possibilities. "Your children," Thomas said, "they're really okay with all this?" "More than okay. They want to be part of it." Catherine squeezed his hand. "Sarah's already talking about setting up a research station here. Michael wants to invest in the renovation. And Emma," she smiled, "Emma says she finally understands why I kept that wooden heart all these years." Thomas started the tractor again, turning them toward home. "Lot of changes coming to this old farm." "Good changes," Catherine said. "Changes that honor what was, while building something new." She leaned against him slightly. "What do you say, Tommy? Ready to help me build some bridges?" Looking at her there, city sophistication against his familiar world, Thomas realized some bridges had already been built. They just needed the courage to cross them. A week later, Thomas stood in his workshop, carefully sanding a piece of cedar wood. The barn doors were open to the evening air, and the sound of animated discussion drifted in from the farmhouse where Catherine and her children were finalizing plans over dinner. His hands moved steadily over the wood, muscle memory guiding the motions. He'd made countless repairs and implements over the years, but this piece was different. This one was about building something new. "There you are." Catherine's voice came from the doorway. "The kids were wondering where you'd disappeared to." "Just needed a moment," he said, not looking up from his work. "Still getting used to all the energy they bring." She crossed to his workbench, her designer heels now traded for practical boots, a change that hadn't gone unnoticed. "Is that what I think it is?" "Maybe." He turned the wood in his hands, a heart taking shape, larger than the one he'd made all those years ago. "Thought it was time for something new, something that reflects who we are now, not just who we were then." Catherine touched the cedar's smooth surface. "It's beautiful, Tommy." "Not finished yet." He pointed to the complex pattern emerging on one side. "See here? It's the watershed pattern from the south field, the one you said showed how natural wisdom and modern planning could work together." "Our bridge," she said softly. "Something like that." He set down his tools. "How'd the call with the board?" "You go. Better than expected. Once they saw the preliminary data from Sarah's team about your farming methods, they started to understand. The rural tech merger is going through, with the advisory board as planned. She smiled. Though I don't think they quite realize their chief agricultural advisor is also the man who's been making their CEO smile like a teenager again. Thomas chuckled. Guess we're all wearing multiple hats these days. Speaking of which, Catherine perched on his workbench. Emma's proposal for the Agricultural Education Center here is gaining traction. Investors are interested. She thinks we could break ground by spring. And you? Thomas asked quietly. You're sure about splitting your time between here and New York? It won't be easy. Nothing worth having ever is. She reached for his hand, wood dust and all. But I've spent 40 years building things I thought I wanted. Now it's time to build something I know I need. From the house, they could hear Emma's laugh mingling with the evening birdsong. Sarah's voice carried some technical term about soil composition, while Michael's deeper tones added something about sustainable infrastructure. Listen to them, Catherine said. They're not just accepting this, they're helping build it. In their own ways, they're healing something that broke long before they were born. Thomas set the unfinished heart aside and drew Catherine closer. We all are. I have something for you, she said, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out a small object that caught the evening light. His old house key, now hanging from a sleek keychain engraved with the coordinates of the farm. I had this made in the city. Thought maybe it was time to make it official. This is home now. Or at least one of them. Thomas took the keychain, feeling the weight of it in his palm. One of them? Well, she smiled. I thought maybe you'd like a key to my place too. For those times when you come to New York to knock some rural wisdom into my board members' heads. He pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her perfume mixed with fresh hay, another bridge between their worlds. Guess we're really doing this, aren't we? We are. She touched the unfinished heart on his workbench. And this time, we're doing it right. Not running from who we are, but building something new from all the pieces of our lives. She paused. Even the broken ones. As if on cue, Emma called from the house, something about needing their input on the education center's design. Their new life was calling, full of possibilities neither of them could have imagined 40 years ago. Spring came early to Nebraska that year. The Matthews place next door had transformed over the winter months, its renovation a testament to the possibility of blending old and new. Solar panels gleamed alongside restored wooden siding, and Catherine's home office window overlooked fields that would soon be green with new growth. The for sale sign on her New York penthouse had garnered significant interest, though Catherine was in no rush to sell. Like everything else in their carefully crafted new life, the transition would happen at its own pace. The contractors finished the last of the tech installations this morning, Catherine said, walking the familiar path between the two properties. She'd taken to wearing a practical blend of city sophistication and country practicality. Tailored, pants tucked into work boots, silk blouse protected by a denim jacket that might have been Thomas's. Sarah's team is coming next week to set up their research stations, Thomas replied, falling into step beside her. Your board still okay with having their agricultural headquarters out here in the middle of nowhere? Catherine smiled. After the quarterly results showed how our new traditional wisdom approach was revolutionizing our tech implementation. They're more than okay with it. She took his hand as they walked, though I don't think they quite understand why their CEO insists on personally overseeing the rural division. Can't imagine why, Thomas teased, bringing their joined hands to his lips. The sound of vehicles approaching drew their attention. Emma's car led a small convoy, Sarah's research team arriving early by the look of the equipment trucks following her. Mom! Tommy! Emma called, climbing out of her car with a tablet in hand. Wait till you see the latest registration numbers for the education center. We're going to need to expand before we even open. Sarah emerged from one of the trucks, her red hair, so like her mother's, caught up in a practical ponytail. The sustainable farming community is buzzing about this place, she added. We've got inquiries from 3 continents about our integrated approach. Thomas watched Catherine's face as she absorbed her daughter's enthusiasm. Having second thoughts about trading your corner office for all this chaos? Never, she squeezed his hand. Though I have to admit, I never imagined my corporate success would lead me right back here. Life has a way of coming full circle, Thomas said, echoing words spoken in a storm-dark barn that felt like yesterday and a lifetime ago. Emma was organizing the research team, her natural leadership evident in every gesture. Sarah had already begun discussing soil samples with her colleagues, her passion for the work shining through. And through it all, Catherine stood grounded between her two worlds, no longer running from either. The morning sun caught something in the window of the renovated house, a wooden heart, larger than the original, mounted where it could catch the light. The watershed pattern carved into its surface told their story. Two separate streams joining to form something stronger, something that honored both its sources while creating something new. "Michael's flying in next weekend," Catherine said, watching her daughter's work. "Says he wants to see for himself how his investment in agricultural innovation is progressing." "All three of them," Thomas marveled. "Who'd have thought they'd be so invested in an old farm in Nebraska?" "Not just the farm," Catherine turned to face him. "They're invested in us, in what we're building here. They see something they want to be part of." A gentle breeze carried the scent of spring, planting across the fields. Soon the land would be green with new growth, proof that with proper care and patience, anything could flourish. 1 year to the day, after a storm brought Catherine Wells back to Thomas Miller's barn, the farm hummed with activity. Students from the Agricultural Education Center moved between the research stations, learning how traditional farming wisdom could enhance modern technology. Sarah supervised soil analysis, while Emma led a seminar on integrated farming approaches. In the renovated farmhouse next door, Catherine concluded a video conference with her New York office, her window offering a view of Thomas teaching a group of young farmers about reading weather patterns without relying solely on forecasting apps. "Meeting adjourned," she said, closing her laptop with a smile. The merger had proved more successful than anyone had predicted, largely due to their unique approach of bridging old and new methods. She made her way down to the barn where it had all begun. Thomas was there, putting the finishing touches on something at his workbench. "Hard to believe it's been a year," she said, wrapping her arms around him from behind. "Is it?" He turned to face her. "Feels like no time and forever all at once." On the workbench lay 2 rings, carved from the wood of both the old and new hearts. The watershed pattern flowed across their surfaces, connecting them like the streams that fed their land. "Think it's time?" Thomas asked softly. Catherine picked up one of the rings, watching how the light played across its polished surface. "Past time," she said, "though I'm glad we waited. Did it right." Outside, they could hear Michael's voice, joining his sisters, having flown in for what he thought was just the anniversary of the education center's founding. The 3 siblings had no idea their mother and Thomas had planned something more intimate for the evening. "You know," Catherine said, "when I left here 40 years ago, I thought I was choosing between love and success." She slipped the ring onto her finger where it felt like it had always belonged. "I never imagined I'd find both in the same place I thought I had to leave." Thomas put on his own ring, the carved pattern aligning perfectly with hers when they joined hands. "Sometimes the longest road leads you right back home." As if to echo that thought, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the fields. They both smiled at the sound. "Storm's coming," Thomas said. "Good thing I know just where to take shelter," Catherine replied, drawing him close. Their lips met as the first drops began to fall, the sound of rain on the barn roof, playing the same song it had a year ago. But this time, there was no need to run, no choice to make, no worlds to bridge. They had built something new from the pieces of their past, something that proved love doesn't have to be left behind in the pursuit of dreams. Sometimes it just needs time to grow, like winter wheat under snow, until it's ready to bloom again. Through the rain, sunlight broke through, casting a rainbow over the fields where their future was already taking root. And in the barn where their story had begun again, two hearts finally beat as one, proving that some loves are worth the wait, and some storms come not to destroy, but to show us the way home.